name is John Green, and welcome to Crash Course U.S. History. Today we're going to be talking about the time period from the Farmers' Revolt to World War II and everything in between, including both World Wars. Stan, cue the intro.
Around 1894, cotton prices declined in America, causing many farmers to go into debt and their land was threatened. The Farmers' Alliance arose and led the Farmers' Revolt in an attempt to convince the federal government to establish warehouses to store food. This would ensure that the farmers would not be dependent on banks or merchants. Also, the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party, spread their efforts for community and organization and education across the nation through pamphlets, newspapers, and speakers.
During the time of the populist evolution, the Pullman strike occurred around the U.S. that shut down the railroads across the country in response to the reductions in wages. The head figures include Eugene V. Debs and George Pullman. Around the same time, the election between Bryan and McKinley occurred. Bryan ran his populist platform off of the silver platform as currency, while Republican McKinley ran off the gold standard, something many other countries used. McKinley won in big eastern cities during the Panic of 1893, speaking for higher wages and lower tariffs.
As the labor movement progressed, blacks experienced segregation. They owned little land to begin with, and they were excluded from unions. I'm going to do that part over. As the labor movement progressed, blacks experienced segregation. They owned little land to begin with, and were excluded from unions. They also experienced lynchings. There was some good that came out of the urbanization because as cities grew, so did the black middle class. The Kansas Exodus was an event that resulted from the growth of these cities. Many African Americans moved to Kansas for political equality, freedom from violence, education, and economic opportunity. The 1890s was also a time for immigration. Many came from Europe, but also from Asia. Nativists in America were opposed to immigrants because they wanted America to stay pure. The government even displayed some prejudice by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers.
Throughout the 1890s, women enjoyed many more opportunities for economic independence and had a much more important role in public life. Nearly every state passed laws giving married women their own wages and property rights, such as being able to sign their own contracts and make wills separate from their husbands. Women's Christian Temperance Union became the largest female organization that argued for employment, political, and educational equality. The movement for women's suffrage also continued to grow throughout this time. At the beginning of the American intervention in the Philippines, many Filipinos welcomed the Americans, but their opinions quickly changed when the Americans began to exercise severe power over them. When McKinley wanted to gain the Philippine Islands, it led to a war lasting for 4 years. McKinley's administration justified their policies on the grounds that they meant to uplift the Filipino people and not take their culture away, but make them more westernized. Once in control, they tried to modernize and westernize the Philippines with railroads, schools, and agriculture.
Okay guys, chapter 18. So we started off in 1900 and there's lots of reforms going on, so we'll start with the muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists who exposed the ills of industrial and urban life. Lewis Hine was a particularly popular muckraker. He photographed child laborers to draw attention to social inequality. The ones who were usually working these jobs were immigrants, and millions of immigrants were coming to America during the Progressive Era, specifically Europeans who entered through Ellis Island in New York. Large numbers of Chinese, Mexican, and Italian immigrants were bound to labor contracts. These contracts were signed with labor agents who then provided the workers to American employees. Many of these immigrants coming to America came in hopes of freedom and opportunity, though this wasn't the case for many. Many immigrants endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. Traditional gender roles were also changing drastically during the Progressive Era. There was a new visibility of women in the workplace who now got to work for wages. The most opportunities came for white, native-born women who could land jobs as office workers or telephone operators. Black and immigrant women did not have as many opportunities as white native-born women, though. Black females still worked primarily as domestic servants or in cotton fields, and immigrant women were largely confined to low-paying factory employment. Feminism was also on the rise. Organizations such as the Feminist Alliance supported women in America. We also see the growing presence of the birth control movement. Many women were advocating for the right of contraceptives. Advocates such as Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger lectured about sex education and other topics. The era's most prominent female reformer was Jane Addams. She founded the Hull House in Chicago, which was devoted to improving the lives of the immigrant poor. Settlement houses workers moved into poor neighborhoods. They built kindergartens and playgrounds for children, established employment bureaus and health clinics, and showed female victims of domestic abuse how to gain legal protection. By 1910, more than 400 settlement houses had been established in cities throughout the U.S. We also see the rise of the campaign for women's suffrage become a mass movement. It wasn't until the Progressive Era that we see a rise in the consumer market. Department stores, chain stores, and retail mail-order houses made goods easily accessible to citizens. Leisure activities such as amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters also rose up. About 25 million Americans were attending motion picture theaters called Nickelodeons due to their cheap admission fee. If any individual exemplified this new consumer society, it was Henry Ford. Let's go to the thought bubble. Ford was the son of an Irish immigrant and worked as an apprentice in Michigan machine shops and later as an engineer. He established the Ford Motor Company in 1905 and created the Model T 3 years later. Ford concentrated on standardizing output and lowering prices. He adopted the assembly line method of production, which reduced the time of assembly. Ford also paid his workers $5 a day, a price unheard of then. Ford made the automobile easily accessible to the ordinary citizen. Many Americans complained about a loss of freedom, both low-paid workers and better-off employees. The lack of industrial freedom was widely believed to lie at the root of the much-discussed labor problem. Economic freedom was the rallying cry of American socialism. The Socialist Party called for immediate reforms such as free college, legislation to improve the condition of laborers, and democratic control over the economy through public ownership of railroads and factories. Eugene B. Debs was a railroad union leader who spread the socialist message across the country, preaching that control of the economy by a democratic government held out the hope of uniting political equality and economic freedom. On the other hand, we have the progressives. Progressives sought to reinvigorate the idea of an activist, socially conscious government. They hoped to reinvigorate democracy by restoring political power to the citizenry and civic harmony to a divided society. Teddy Howard, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, those are our three progressive presidents. Roosevelt was the first, and he implemented a program called the Square Deal, which attempted to confront the problems caused by economic consolidation by distinguishing between good and bad trusts. He also pushed for more direct federal regulation of the economy. Not to mention, Roosevelt was a big sympathizer of the conservation movement. Taft took on the presidency after Roosevelt, and he pursued the antitrust policy more aggressively than Roosevelt. And then Woodrow Wilson took over the presidency. He was a strong executive leader and moved aggressively to implement his version of progressivism.
Watchful waiting was Wilson's policy of rejecting alliances with leaders who took control by force. Wilson implemented this policy by refusing to accept the leadership of Huerta of Mexico when he took over with a violent revolution. The policy ended when the U.S. sent forces to retaliate against Mexico, which he had arrested American sailors on its borders. Americans' role in global politics increased drastically in the early 1900s. However, we took a stance of neutrality against the tension and fighting in Europe. The U.S. mainly entered the war due to the fall of the Tsar in Russia, Germany's resumed summer warfare, and the Zimmerman Note. During the war, paranoia was at an all-time high. Many believed that Germans would come into the U.S. and infiltrate the government with communist ideas. Organizations such as the CPI helped to create a frenzy atmosphere and spread propaganda. The feeling of mass paranoia became known as the Red Scare, a movement that swept across the nation as radical labor unions were branded enemies and their leaders were incarcerated. Businesses used strike breakers and other oil-fueled tactics against unions, and Palmer raids, which were radical groups in the U.S., were arrested, and over 500 immigrants were deported as a result. As much of the focus was on Germany and the Soviets, it was no surprise that the civil rights fell on the back burner. The government was criticized for focusing only on the rights of people in the East while ignoring their own people. Women served as clerks or in medical units, while over 400,000 African Americans were drafted and enlisted into the Army. However, African Americans were kept in segregated units and were usually in labor battalions. Oh, it's time for mystery document already?
I wish to admit the truth of all that has been testified to you in this proceeding. Gentlemen, you have heard the report of my speech at Canton on June 16, and I submit that there is not a word in that speech to warrant the charges set out in the indictment. And what I had to say there, my purpose was to have the people understand something about the social system in which we live and to prepare them to change this system by perfectly peaceable and orderly means into what I, as a socialist, conceive to be a real democracy. I have never advocated violence in any form. I have always believed in an education, in intelligence, and enlightenment, and I've always made my appeal to the reason and to the conscience of the people. Bernie Sanders. I do not.
You get the shock pen.
I was
You got
going to
it.
say, somebody doing progressive, like a Boss Tweed, something, I don't know.
During the war, paranoia was at an all-time high. Many believed that Germans would come into the U.S. and infiltrate the government with communist ideas. Organizations such as the CPI created a frenzied atmosphere and created propaganda. The feeling of mass paranoia became known as the Red Scare, a movement that swept across the nation as radical labor unions were branded enemies and their leaders were incarcerated. Businesses used strikebreakers and other ordeal tactics against unions, and Palmer raids occurred, where radical groups in the U.S. were arrested in 30 cities, and over 500 immigrants were deported as a result. As much focus was on Germany and the Soviets, it is no surprise that civil rights fell on the back burner. The government was criticized for focusing on the rights of people across the seas while not focusing on the people's rights at home. Women served as clerks in medical units, while over 400,000 African Americans were drafted and enlisted in the Army. However, African Americans were kept in segregated units and were usually in labor battalions. The 14 Points were formed as President Wilson's attempt at a peace plan. It called for open peace treaties and promoted free trade, transport along the seas, and arms reduction. Many in Europe found this too accommodating, and American citizens feared future integration and entanglement. The Treaty of Versailles ended up going against the 14 Points in their majority, but these points did lead to the League of Nations. World War I ends with the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany gets the short stick, which, believe it or not, will come back to bite us in our high and mighty behind. In this treaty, Germany had to pay extreme amounts of money, admit the war was entirely their fault, disarm and cede German and colonial territories to the Allies, and Germany was humiliated and in economic ruin, setting the stage for World War II.